from our keynote speaker, Dr. Richard Ferguson, University of Utah and Black Physicians of Utah. Dr. Ferguson?
All right, I thank you again for the introduction there. I see more my purpose here as, I don't know if I'm the first or second or third physician to speak today, but I think a physician's perspective on Henrietta Lack's life, and particularly that of a Black physician. So I'll share actually my first experience that I had hearing about Henrietta Lack's story and her cell line. So, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, honored colleagues, when I was asked to give a speech today as a representative of BPOU, I recalled the first time I heard Henrietta Lack's story as a young high school student working in the immunogenetics lab at Howard University's med school back in the early 90s. I remember my mentor, Dr. Paulette Harris, pulling me aside and telling me that the cell line that I was working with as part of my gene sequencing project were HeLa cells. She shared with me the story of how the cells were originally taken from a Black woman in the Baltimore area that died of cervical cancer. It didn't have a lot of significance to me at that time. I was 16, 17 years old. She then shared more about how most of Lack's family didn't know of her cell's contribution to science and medicine until long after her death. That was over 30 years ago. And what is kind of disheartening is that her history and legacy was not discussed at any point, and I emphasize at any point, during my medical education from Michigan State, where I went to med school, to my time in the Army as a battalion and brigade surgeon, or even during my residency at University of Utah. I hope this has changed by now. I did not learn more about her legacy and impact on medicine until, formally speaking with my prior mentor in high school, until I crossed by a book when I was studying at the Barnes & Nobles in Sugar House. And that was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lack. Ever since that time, I've shared her story again and again, as Dr. Paulette Harris did for me many years ago. I share it with my mentees, loved ones, and colleagues when discussing the contributions that African Americans have contributed to modern medicine. Although what I will share will be reminiscent of the film shown earlier today. Did people see the film? Was part of it shown? Yeah. Okay, all right. I was trying to time for that. But I'm hopeful that a Black physician perspective, once again, will be beneficial. So today I want to explore the profound bioethical importance and the indelible impact of Henrietta Lack's HeLa cells and modern medical advancements. But first, let's understand a bit more about the woman behind the life-changing HeLa cell line. Mind you, some of this may be a little bit repetitive, but I found it sets the tone of her achievements. So Henrietta, from Clover, Virginia, to Turner Station, Maryland, when her husband, Day Lack, took a job at Bethlehem Steel Sparrow's Point Mill plant. Henrietta had 4 children at that time and was pregnant with a 5th child, Joe, I believe, when she began to show signs and symptoms of cervical cancer. These signs and symptoms, primarily worrisome of bleeding and a lump on her cervix, her tumor was seen before the birth of her youngest child, Joe, and on her follow-up exam 6 weeks later, but was missed or dismissed on examination. And actually, to give a little bit more context, it was misdiagnosed at that time. This often isn't a part of her story that's often told. It was actually diagnosed as being a epidermoid carcinoma of her cervix for the docs and providers in the audience, when it was actually metastatic adenocarcinoma of her cervix. And that actually didn't come out until around 1970. Mind you, she passed in 1951. She experienced a delay of care, which many African Americans to this day, due to institutional systemic racism, still experience delays in care. The delay of care she received in the care of renowned gynecologists, Dr. Howard Jones, led her to going several months before officially being diagnosed with cervical cancer. Well, shortly after her diagnosis, Henrietta had no idea how she would go from an ordinary woman from Virginia to unknowingly contributing to one of the most significant chapters in medical science. As seen and stated earlier this afternoon, during her battle with cervical cancer, a small biopsy was taken from Henrietta without her consent or knowledge. Little did she or her family know that these cells will become an immortal cell line. Now, the bioethical dimensions of Henrietta Lack's story should prompt us to reflect on issues of consent, autonomy, and the responsible use of human tissues. Her story raises questions about the ethical considerations surrounding medical research and the rights of individuals whose biological materials become instrumental in scientific breakthroughs. Unfortunately, I see many parallels in Mrs. Lack's story, highlighting a dark facet of America's medical and scientific progress, fueled by racist, unethical practices in the past and present that have taken so much from black people and given very little in return. What if I told you that although Lack's family may have received monetary restitution from Thermo Fisher this year for what happened over 70 years ago, there are other black Virginians and Americans like Lack's whose bodies and tissues have also contributed to medical and scientific progress. So where is their reward? Where is their atonement? The sepia-skinned victims of Richmond grave robbers, the unidentified black people whose bodies were stolen and dissected so that physicians at Virginia medical schools could better study anatomy. What payment did they or their relatives get for giving their bodies into the hands of white medical professionals? None. What about the thousands of African Americans who were forcibly sterilized, sometimes without their knowledge, under Virginia's 1924 Eugenical Sterilization Act, legislation that wasn't outlawed until 1979? What do they get? Nothing. And lastly, a story we are all very familiar with. What about the 600 black men infected with syphilis as administrators of the Tuskegee experiment watched the disease ravage them, never offering penicillin to treat the condition? What benefit did they reap? Many of these men had died by the time a class action lawsuit awarded a piddly $10 million to survivors and their descendants in 1974. The disrespect of black bodies has been a long part of our American medical history. We right now have measures of consent ingrained into our medical training and biomedical research. I pray history does not repeat itself. Henrietta Lack, a woman whose life was marked by adversity, leaves us with a legacy that compels us to revisit and reevaluate the ethical foundations of medical research. Now, let's take a minute to focus on the groundbreaking, life-saving, and life-creating achievements that are a direct result of the HeLa cell line. First, HeLa cells played a crucial role in the development of the polio vaccine. Dr. Jonas Salk used HeLa cells to test the vaccine's effectiveness before he had his significant trial where it was used in U.S. children, Canadian children, Finland children, and actually slightly before that. So remember, her cells were harvested without consent in 1951. And then in 1953, he took the inactivated polio virus at that time, tested it on himself and his family. So there's some ethical concerns there as well. But we're not going to talk about Jonas Salk too much today. But the thing is, the impact is after he then tested the cells before the massive trial that was not only in the U.S., Canada, and Finland in HeLa cells, before officially the vaccine getting approved in 1955 and being released worldwide. Second, HeLa cells have been extensively used in cancer research, particularly, and this is what many people do not know from her story, particularly in the prevention of the very cancer that took the life of Henrietta, cervical cancer. The HeLa cell line contributed to the discovery of the human papillomavirus, which causes cervical cancer and ultimately the creation of the now HPV vaccine. Cervical cancer rates have dropped dramatically worldwide particularly quite a bit in the U.S. We still got a lot of work to do here in Utah, so talk to your junior high folks and your high schoolers. But that is such a dramatic impact, tested and developed from experimentation with the HeLa cell line. Third, not only did the HeLa cells lay the groundwork for HPV vaccine development, but were also pivotal in what we know today as genome mapping, some of which I was involved in during my time as a young high school student at Howard. This fascinating development occurred in the mid-1960s when HeLa cells were fused with mouse cells, creating the first documented human-animal hybrid cells. Those cells, in turn, became important in the early days of gene mapping. I won't go into too much details, but it's pretty unique on how a protein was produced out of these hybrid cells that led to a lot of the foundations for gene mapping. And lastly, the use of HeLa cells led to the development of life, in vitro fertilization, by the very same doctor that diagnosed and partially misdiagnosed Henrietta with cervical cancer. Dr. Howard Jones of Johns Hopkins, particularly, in 1951, was a provider that diagnosed her with cervical cancer. He used her cells to test the effects of different environments on fertilized eggs to perfect the first in vitro egg fertilization in 1981. So I would just like everyone to know, yet as we marvel at the scientific advancements facilitated by HeLa cells, we must also acknowledge the ethical complexities that accompany such progress. Excuse me. The story of Henrietta Lack challenges us to confront ethical lapses of the past, inspiring our commitment to a more just and transparent future in medical research. In recent years, there have been significant strides in recognizing the rights of individuals in the context of medical research. The story of Henrietta Lack serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of informed consent, privacy, and the equitable distribution of the benefits of scientific progress. It calls on us to build an ethical framework that honor the contributions of individuals like Henrietta, her family, and to ensure that the benefits of medical advancements are shared equitably across society. So in conclusion, Henrietta Lack's HeLa cells have left an indelible mark on modern medical science, both in terms of groundbreaking discoveries and the ethical questions they raise. Let us honor her memory by fostering a culture of respect, transparency, and justice in medical research, a culture that ensures the benefits of scientific progress are shared by all. Thank you.